The subject of how we got the Bible is such a fascinating topic to undertake. And today we want to take a look at just a brief survey of the content of the Bible. And then we'll talk about the different writing materials, the manuscripts and versions and things like this that we have today. That's the way the Bible came down to us. The origin of the Bible is a fascinating story in itself. The Old Testament was written over a long period of time, and we really don't know exactly the dates of writing of these books. Most of the books were written very early, but some of the other books were written in the 8th century, the 7th century, and the 6th century BC. The New Testament, though, is a different story. The New Testament was written over a period of about 45 to 55 years, something like that. But between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, there was a period of about 300 or 400 years, and different men wrote during that period of time and referred to some of these books of the Old Testament. And so Josephus, one of the great historians of this period of time, told us that the last book, Malachi, in the Old Testament, was the last book that was written, in fact. The Old Testament then came to a close with the writing of the book of Malachi. Now, what about the New Testament? Well, the New Testament, as we said, came into existence over a period of about 45 to 50 years. The origin of the New Testament is quite different from the origin of the Old Testament. Well, the Old Testament was written primarily to the Hebrew people as a history and the wisdom literature and prophetic literature relating to the Hebrew people. The New Testament, on the other hand, was written over a period of 45 to 55 years, as we stated, but it was written to individuals and to churches. These individuals in churches made up the Christians, both Jews and Gentiles, of that time period. Such men as Paul and James and Peter and Jude and John, they all wrote these things that have come down to us in what we call the New Testament. Paul wrote 13 books, James wrote 1 book, Peter wrote 2 books, and Jude wrote 1 book. But then what about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? These 4 books are called the Gospels, and they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them tells us something about the life of Christ. They are not continuous. Each one gives his own story as he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. And then we have the book of Hebrews, which is an anonymous book. We have the book of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. They're also anonymous books. We have the book of Acts, written by Luke, and yet he never calls his name in that book. And then finally we have the single book of prophecy in the New Testament called the book of Revelation. Well, how did these books originate? The preaching of the Word of God, the Gospel, preceded the writing of any of these books. Early after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, the apostles went out and began to preach and to teach. For example, we find out that Paul went to the city of Corinth, along with many other cities that he went to. And while he was in Corinth, he established a church there. Sometime later, after he left Corinth, he got word from the household of Chloe and also from the church itself that there were problems there in the church at Corinth. And so Paul sat down and wrote them a letter and advised them through inspiration how they should solve the problems that they were facing. Well, that book, or that letter, became our book of 1 Corinthians. Sometime later, he wrote another letter to them, and that's our book of 2 Corinthians. Well, Paul wrote 13 of these books to churches and also to individuals like Philemon or Timothy or Titus. And then we have the book of Revelation, which is written by John. It was written about AD 95. and that was the last book to be written. It's also the last book in the New Testament. So that gives just kind of a brief summary of the origin of the New Testament. That in itself is a very fascinating story. But let's talk about the history of Christianity. After we leave the Bible, this beginning of the 2nd century and the 3rd century and so forth, after we leave the Bible, we find out that the church was growing in the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire was having trouble over this very thing. One reason was that some people thought, and particularly in government, they thought that the Christians were opposed to Rome. And as a result, they began persecuting the church. And so the empire was having troubles and the church was having troubles. And these things clashed. The persecutions that began were, for the most part, localized persecutions, but some of them were very, very severe. Some of them were organized very well. Some of them were somewhat loose. Well, brief rebellions of one sort or another, political rebellions, arose in the empire, not led by the Christians, of course, but the Christians got a lot of blame for this because some of the Romans thought that the gods were angry with the Roman Empire because the Christians were teaching that there's only one God. And so brief rebellions arose up in Greece and Spain, the Balkan countries, and Asia Minor, Germany, and so forth. And this brought a great deal of trouble also to the Christians. There were about 5 million Christians, it's estimated, by this time, the 3rd century. Some of these 5 million people were prominent citizens. Some had governmental positions, some were in the army, some were business people. There was a variety of positions and professions that the Christians occupied. They were persecuted still. Empire-wide persecutions didn't begin until about 250, however, under an emperor by the name of Valerian. In all of this, the Christians were becoming a very effective minority. The church had peace, relative peace anyway, for a period of about 45 years when a great deal of this persecution had finally gone away. Well, it didn't last very long. 45 years passed quickly, and an emperor by the name of Diocletian came to the throne of Rome. In about 303, he issued 3 edicts. These edicts were edicts of persecution. He advocated and accomplished the destruction of church buildings, the burning of Christian religious books, the imprisonment of all Christian ministers, and finally the enslavement of many of the people who were serving the Christians just as household servants. Well, we don't know exactly the reasons why this fellow, Diocletian, began his persecutions. However, this whole thing of maybe the gods are angry with Rome because of the Christians, that popped up again, and that may very well have been one of the reasons for that persecution. Strange as it might seem, Diocletian's wife was a Christian. And the man who followed him, a fellow by the name of Galerius, his wife also was a Christian, and Galerius continued the persecution. These persecutions were not very widespread, but they did go from Britain all the way over to Arabia, but they were spasmodic in the beginning, later became empire-wide. Some historians say that Diocletian considered the Christians to be such a threat to the Roman Empire that the Christians were a personal threat to him. Well, at least one good thing came out of this, though. Because of the burning of Christian books, the Christians had to stop and think about which books that we have are authoritative. Because a lot of people had written various things in Christian circles about the life of Christ or exhortations to live right. There were various controversies that arose and things that were written along those lines. So the Christians then had to decide what books are authoritative and what books are inspired, what books are, on the other hand, just written by friends of Christians or Christians themselves. So this helped in the formation of what we call the canon, or the New Testament as we have it today. The word canon means a measure. What they were saying was that some of these books measure up. That is, they were written by apostles or companions of apostles. We call those books inspired. And then some were just written by interested Christians, very much as we have today, where interested Christians are writing books to each other and books for sale. So the fixing of the canon was helped by the persecution that Diocletian brought on. Just prior to the year 303 AD, there was a man by the name of Constantius who became emperor. Constantius had a son named Constantine, who turned out to be one of the most famous of all of the Roman emperors. And Constantius was a co-emperor with a fellow by the name of Licinius. One had the eastern part of the empire, and the other administered the western part of the empire. Well, when Constantine came to the throne, he and Linnaeus ruled together. And fortunate for the Christians, the Edict of Milan was given. The Edict of Milan said that Christianity is a legal religion. Christianity was not made the religion of the empire, as some people seem to think, but Christian religion was a legal religion. Notice what was said here. The persecution of Christians ended in 313 when Constantine of the west and Licinius of the east proclaimed the Edict of Milan, which established a policy of religious freedom for all. This is what one of the historians has said. Well, the Edict of Milan itself reads in part like this. Therefore it pleased us, that is Constantine and Linnaeus, it pleased us to remove all conditions whatsoever, which were in the rescript formerly given to you officially. Any one of these who wish to observe the Christian religion may do so freely and openly, without molestation. We thought it fit to commend these things most fully to your care, that you may know that we have given to those Christians free and unrestricted opportunity of religious worship. Well, of course, this was a great thing to happen to the Christians, and guess what? The demand for Bibles arose. Constantine commissioned Eusebius of Caesarea, a man who has later become known as the father of church history. He commissioned Eusebius to produce 50 copies of the Bible. Those 50 copies were, of course, copied by hand on the materials that we're getting ready to talk about. Well, what kind of materials were these that the Bible was copied on? Originally, the writers of the Bible would have been using papyrus. But you remember in our first lesson we talked about the development of parchment and the development of vellum. And so these are the materials that they wrote. But how did these materials categorize themselves? Well, the first thing we have are the Greek manuscripts. Then we have the ancient versions. And then we have a group of manuscripts called the lectionaries. And then finally we have a group of manuscripts called the patristics. We won't get to all of those today, but we will get to a number of these things. The Greek manuscripts, let's take them first. The Greek manuscripts, well, there's about 5,000 of them, a little more than 5,000 actually. They are sometimes single sheets. Sometimes they're just simply fragments. Sometimes they're a whole book in the Bible, and sometimes they are a collection of a number of books in the Bible. We want to take a look at some of these. The Greek manuscripts made out of papyrus, some of those have still have survived and are still with us. They're very fragile. As we mentioned last time in our first lesson, the papyrus was, it dried out and became brittle, and so it would break. Well, the question always comes up, how is it that people, scholars, how do they go about dating these manuscripts? Well, there are a number of criteria that they use. I certainly won't mention all of them, but here are some of the criteria that they use because they studied these things for literally hundreds of years. For example, are there any spaces between the words? If there are, that indicates that a manuscript is rather late. Is the manuscript itself dated? Sometime at the end of a manuscript, the scribe, the copyist, would write what was called a colophon. And in that colophon, sometime he would identify the ruler who was in power at the time that he wrote. That gives us a good idea of how old that manuscript is. And then also whether or not the letters are straight up, block letters, or are they slanted letters? Are they rounded? Or are they cursive, capital or capital letters? Are there any punctuation marks? What kind of material was used? What color is the ink? What is the chemical composition of the ink? And since this has been studied for hundreds of years, scholars can identify very, very closely the age of a manuscript by using these kinds of criteria. Let's take a look here at this next picture. The Chester Beatty Papyri. Well, this particular one comes from about 180 to 200 BC, AD, and it's of a portion of the book of Hebrews. There are about 70 papyrus, the manuscripts, that are available to us. Notice that these are capital letters, and they're rather straight. Then there's another papyrus manuscript of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 33 through chapter 12 and verse 9. This also is referred to as one of the Chester Beatty papyri. You know, Christians like to go from one passage to another passage. Maybe a passage in the early part of Matthew to a passage in the late part of Matthew. But it was very hard to do that on scrolls. And so the Christians cut these papyrus scrolls up into sheets. They stacked the sheets up, folded them together, as we mentioned last time, and they sewed them together, and they made a book very similar to the books that we have today. And these books were called codex books. It's very easy to use, and scholars believe that Christians were very instrumental in the formation and the development of these books. And then there's another Chester Beatty papyrus. This one from Acts chapter 17, verses 9 through 17, and this dates about 250 AD. Chester Beatty, the Chester Beatty Museum in Dublin, Ireland, contains these various manuscripts, these various papyrus manuscripts, and also many other manuscripts as well as other antiquities. This little fragment that we have of John chapter 18 verses 31 to 33 is a very fascinating fragment. Why? Well, because it's the earliest fragment that we have of any part of the New Testament. It comes from the early part of the 2nd century. You see, liberal scholarship thought for a long time that the book of John was not written until on up in the 2nd century sometime. However, when the John Ryland fragment was found, and they found out that it was dated in the early part of the 2nd century, and it had already gotten all the way down to Egypt, they revised their idea of the date of writing of the book of John. And now scholars all believe that the book of John was written very early, probably about 90 AD. The manuscript that we have before us now is one of the very famous manuscripts. It's called the Codex Vaticanus, and it dates back to the early 4th century. That's about the time of the Edict of Milan, come to think of it. And people have wondered if this might be one of the manuscripts that Eusebius was ordered to by Constantine to collect. We don't know that for a fact, but that is thought by some to be a possibility. Well, the Council of Nicaea also met about this time. That was the first general council of the church. Now, this Codex Vaticanus contains most of the books of the New Testament. And it also contains the Latin version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. Now, the Vaticanus was not available at the time that the King James Version was translated. That's unfortunate because the King James Version is one of the most popular English versions that's ever been made. But the Codex Vaticanus, our oldest manuscript, was not available at that time. The Codex Vaticanus remained in the Vatican Library for an unknown period of time. It was probably there from somewhere around 1475, but nobody knew anything about it. When it was found out that there was such a manuscript there in the Vatican, two great text scholars, a man by the name of Samuel P. Tregelles and another man by the name of Constantine von Tischendorf, they went together to look at this manuscript. They were allowed to look at it, but they were not allowed to make any notations. They could not write anything about it. And there was someone standing there to supervise that. Well, Tischendorf was kind of an emotional man, it seems. He just couldn't stand to see this great valuable manuscript in front of him and at the same time not be able to make any notes on it. And so he began making notes to himself, and they took the manuscript away. Well, the English Revised Version of the Bible, which was translated in about 1885 to 1890, that was the first the first Bible to be translated using this great manuscript called the Codex Vaticanus. The next manuscript that we look at is the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus both came from the 4th century. It's probable that the Sinaiticus came from the middle of the 4th century, while the Vaticanus came from the early 4th century. It was discovered by this man, Constantine von Tischendorf, that I mentioned just a moment ago. And there's such a fascinating story about how this manuscript was discovered. First of all, Tischendorf was looking for manuscripts, and he knew that at the monastery of St. Catherine, at the foot of the location of the traditional Mount Sinai, that in that monastery there were a number of manuscripts, and he wanted to go investigate this. And so he did. And when he got there and he was looking around and doing some of his work, he noticed in a box that there was an old manuscript, and as he glanced at it, he thought to himself, this is the most ancient writing I have ever seen. Tischendorf was a great scholar, and he began talking to some others about this manuscript. They said, well, this is just, we've been using some of these things to kindle a fire in our furnace. No telling how many manuscripts had been burned up by these people because they didn't know the value of the manuscript. Tischendorf was very excited about this discovery. Well, when he got so excited about it, they decided, well, wait a minute now, maybe this is really worth something. And they took it out of the trash box, and they would not let Tischendorf have it. It took a number of years of negotiation, and finally the Tsar of Russia, who was the patron of that monastery, that is the Tsar of Russia, arranged for Tischendorf to have that manuscript, and it was carried back and given to the Russians. But it took, it was discovered in about 1844, but it was about 1857 or 58 before the manuscript actually came to light for scholars to use. Well, again, the manuscript was not available at the time of the translation of the King James Version. The next manuscript that we have is the Codex Alexandrinus. It has an interesting history, what little bit we know about its history, but its history really is shrouded in mystery. We know that it was in Alexandria for a while. We know it was in Constantinople for a while. And then Cyril Lucar was going to give the manuscript to King James of England, but King James died before the manuscript reached him. Now there's another type of manuscripts. These are called the cursive manuscripts. The cursive manuscripts don't use block letters, but rather they use a flowing hand, a cursive writing hand. These manuscripts come from about the 9th century forward. So you can see right away that they are not as valuable in the reproduction of the original text as would be the uncial manuscripts that we just finished talking about. But they do play a prominent part, a prominent role in the history of the transmission, because the King James Version itself was translated primarily from the cursive manuscripts. Then notice the difference in the writing style of these manuscripts compared with the uncial manuscripts. You can compare them right here on this slide. It shows one that has capital letters, block letters, written in columns, and you see the other written in a flowing cursive hand, and there's quite a difference in the style of writing. The next section that we look at is a section that has to do with iconography, decorated manuscripts. Manuscripts that are decorated with artwork are referred to as illuminated manuscripts. These illuminated manuscripts are all cursive manuscripts, and they come rather late. There's one here that is referred to as the Majestic Christ. One of the important things about this is that it indicates a great deal of gold and silver were used in some of these icons or some of this artwork. Well, originally that was the way it was supposed to be. The icons were supposed to be made primarily up of gold leaf and silver. These manuscripts, for the most part, are of a relatively late date. Here in the next picture we have Ezra rewriting some of the law, the sacred records. And this is from a Latin manuscript, the Vulgate. It dates to about 700 to 716 AD. Next we have an illuminated manuscript of Mark. This dates at about 1040 to 1070 AD. Notice the differences in the type of artwork that we see. Next we have Moses expounding the law. Well, notice what the text says there. This early 12th century icon is divided into two sections. The upper scene shows Moses and Aaron delivering the law to the Israelites, and the lower shows Moses dividing the clean animals from the unclean animals. And then we have another one, which is, again, Mark writing his gospel. This was a favorite thing among the artists. There's something of particular interest, though, here about this manuscript and the icons in this manuscript. The earliest icons in the illuminated manuscripts were created in certain monasteries. However, in the 13th century and forward, secular artists began working on these manuscripts. They worked in commercial workshops, and they began producing commercial icons for the manuscripts. This was quite a break from previous practices. And then next we have an Ethiopian manuscript. Notice the difference in the art styles of these various manuscripts, and also in the quality of these various manuscripts. You see, every culture has its own style of art. Every country, in some cases, has its own style of art, and this shows up in the manuscripts of the New Testament. Well, finally, what about the copying of these manuscripts? Yes, they were copied by hand. Early on, they were individually copied. But then a little later, as the demand became greater, they were copied in what were called scriptoriums, where there would be one man who would read the manuscript, and then others would copy as he read. This gives you a glimpse into the nature of the Bible, a little bit about the content of the Bible and its layout. It tells us also something about the early Greek manuscripts. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about the ancient version. You see, everybody wanted the Bible in his own language. And so the Bible was translated into a wide variety of languages very early on. Fascinating subject about how this came about. So we look forward to seeing you next time.